Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
First, thank you so much for talking to me about this. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. My name is Jessica Pishko. I use she, her pronouns. I am a lawyer and a writer, and I have been researching and writing about sheriffs for about the past decade.
Okay. And thank you for being here. I appreciate the time and the energy that you put into this topic. So coming up on September 9th, 2023, there's an event being organized by a group calling itself Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is going to be occurring in Cherokee, North Carolina, which is in western North Carolina near the Tennessee border. Would you briefly speak a little bit about this group, CSPOA, that you've been researching and keeping an eye on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the group calls themselves the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, the CSPOA for short. They are the largest organization of a group of sheriffs and kind of other like-minded followers and deputies that call themselves the quote-unquote constitutional sheriff movement. So the CSPOA, while it is the biggest player in this constitutional sheriff area, they're not the only one. The CSPOA was started by an ex-sheriff from Arizona named Richard Mack. The CSPOA is pretty much his brainchild. 2009 is when he first started the organization. So very shortly after the election of Barack Obama, not coincidentally, and just before the Oath Keepers formed. So they're sort of like in the same stew when they both formed, which we could talk more about later. The CSPOA's general reason to exist is that they view themselves as a training and information disseminating platform. So they are not registered as a nonprofit. You can donate money to them, but those donations would not be tax deductible. They appear to largely function as a sort of information hub. So they provide information and then they disseminate that information to their followers, largely by means of these trainings. So these live trainings are sort of their primary project, which is that they go from place to place to place and have these kind of almost like a tent revival, or sometimes I call it like a medicine show. Like they go from place to place to place, and Richard Mack and his other allies will present this information to other sheriffs as a way of gaining momentum and gaining more members. They don't really participate in things like litigation. They're not even that social media savvy. They don't do that much social media. It's really very reliant on these like face-to-face meetings. And I can go into what they teach, or wasn't sure if you had questions at that point.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about what they're teaching. Well, first up, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about specifically, because there's such a focus on sheriffs in particular, and they hold a specific position in American right-wing ideology, as well as like literal political positioning in law enforcement in the United States. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the water in which they're treading. What is the difference between sheriffs and police in the United States? Maybe talk a little bit about some of the older history of that sort of office and how they developed in the U.S. context.
Sure. It's actually pretty interesting. So to compare it to police, which I think people have a generally pretty good context of, the city police at this point, I think people enough has gotten out there on like popular media that people are more aware that what we now call the police started from slave patrols in the U.S. and that these sort of developed into what we would now call like the city police. And so you would have the Asheville City Police or the Charlotte City Police or the NYPD. Those are your police. And police are set up by a city, and their leaders or police chiefs are now chosen. They're like administrative leaders chosen by the leadership of the city. So I sometimes say that like police chiefs are kind of more like CEOs. They're like appointed to run a department. They go from place to place. So like your police chief might be someone who used to live in, Oakland or St. Louis. So like they move around, and that's kind of the position that police are in at this point for, a few different reasons, but that's one of the reasons that they see themselves as this sort of professionalized organization. Sheriffs, on the other hand, didn't really come from that same background. Not that that makes them like any less involved in racism or white supremacy, but just rather that they came from a sort of different place. Now, what's interesting about sheriffs is they're very invested in their history. So if you read history, they'll say something like, most people will hear a version of, oh, they came from the Shire Reeve, which is this sort of quasi-medieval England thing, that England was divided into shires and each one had a reeve. This is sort of like the Sheriff of Nottingham type stuff. Like the Sheriff of Nottingham collected taxes for the king, and that's why everybody hated him so much. England did have shire reeves. It's not clear to me how much connection they have to like modern day sheriffs, but so be it. When the colonies formed, many of them imported a similar figure that they began to call a sheriff. And the sheriff was sort of it was not an elected figure initially. It was an appointed figure. And most of what he did was collect taxes. And sometimes they did something like, I'm using he because they were obviously all men in that time, but I just want to be clear. They don't have to be men, but they were mostly men. So I often use he as the default pronoun. They would go from house to house, collect taxes, often collect ballots. So like the way people voted was not how we vote today, but often the sheriff would be responsible for going from house to house and like getting people's votes. So it's sort of a weird administrative position that didn't have that much to do with law enforcement. In the 1800s, there was a sort of burst of a desire for more democracy. This is what some people call like the Jacksonian democracy movement, which is sort of based on then President Andrew Jackson's idea that the sort of common man, I'm using man kind of specifically here, that the common man needed like more representation in their local government. And around that time, the sheriff became an elected position, as did many other local positions. So for example, a lot of places elect judges, you elect your county prosecutor, you elect your county government. So all these positions became elected, and the sheriff is one of them. And then this is sort of around the same time that the sheriff as an elected position became something closer to law enforcement, which became particularly important after the Civil War, when, especially in the South, in the South, largely land was organized by plantations, and most plantation owners sort of regulated what we might call disorder or crimes as they wished, right? They would sort of, this was sort of a time where if you were on a land, the plantation owner would discipline their enslaved people as they wanted to, as they saw fit. After the Civil War, sheriffs became more involved in law enforcement as county elected officials, largely because there was no longer slavery as an official regime no longer existed. Sheriffs largely stepped into this role. And at the same time, we saw a lot of expansion of the United States into the West. And sheriffs began to play a larger role as a sort of quasi-military, quasi-law enforcement, quasi-administrative entity that was imported in the West and, was sort of responsible for, I would say, something like ensuring that the kind of Anglo way of government was being properly spread, right? Like we were sort of going into these regions that were populated with Native Americans. A lot of the territories in the southwestern United States, they were populated by people who were Mexican. And so you sort of had these sheriffs who were these Anglo figures kind of going in and sort of importing like a system there that would sort of start to anglicize or, quote unquote, Americanize like regulations and systems and sort of, push white supremacy and then push other people out.
When I think of at least Hollywood representations of that sort of period of time, the role of the sheriff is usually this very literal, like thin blue line between robbers or marauders of whatever stripe, or foreign agents or whatever, and the peace of the white settler. And so I think like in the U.S. the Anglo-U.S. imaginary, at least, it's a very like this big cathartic part of that imaginary of safekeeping of the future of this society and this culture. But they're given a lot of leeway in the imaginary around being a sort of Punisher, like vigilante sort of figure. They could just deputize at will to get a thing done. They oftentimes are meting out what would be called what is called frontier justice. That I think it's important to point to imaginaries that are being drawn upon for actual political movements, because it says a lot about the intentions and the desires of those movements. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit with the framing that you just gave of what the concept of a constitutional sheriff is, like what the theory and the precedent that the proponents propose might be.
Yeah, and honestly, I think your point about the imaginary is really, really important here. And I kind of want to also put, most people, when they think of sheriffs, honestly, are more likely to think of fictional sheriffs. Except for maybe Joe Arpaio, you would think of, you're going to think of John Wayne, right? Like, I think folks think, they think of Bill Daggett, or, you think of like TV sheriffs. And I think honestly that imagination is a large part of what makes the job. And it sort of creates this like it's like a cross-pollination, right? There's sort of, at the same time, we have an immense change in how law enforcement functions in society, right? No question, between, 1850 and 2020, there's a huge change in what police do everywhere overall. And then you also import this sort of imaginary figure. So one of the things I'll say about Richard Mack and the CSPOA is I went to a rally of his at some point around 2021. He was doing a series of kind of like roadshow rallies, which again, these in-person meetings are really important to him. We had a bus, and on the side of the bus, and he used the same image in front of the podium, there was an image of a Native American in sort of full traditional Native American dress, and then an image of Mount Rushmore with, I forgot who's, probably George Washington's face, I think was the focus. Mm-hmm. Yeah, white guys. And then an image of a sheriff with like a hat, like a shadow, like you see the shadow, like the hat and the guy on the horse, etc. And I just thought to myself, like, this is a really interesting, like, imaginary history of like the noble Native American, and the president and the imaginary sheriff, like, right? This is a wholly imaginary set of circumstances that is like not at all representative of any facts. So like Richard Mack very specifically is really invested in that imagination. And some of that comes from his roots in other movements. In part, one of his most important influences actually comes from his background in the Church of Latter-day Saints, and sort of a strain of Mormonism that's really invested in the history of the U.S. and the Constitution, and sees the Constitution as very holy and spiritual. And also at the same time kind of lionizes some of these figures. So the sheriff sort of gets lionized along with it. Richard Mack borrowed heavily from a lot of other ideas, which we can kind of get into. But in essence, what he did was built upon them, and built upon kind of modern anxieties and fears, to create an idea of the sheriff as this sort of like, in his mind, the sheriff is the ultimate peacekeeper, right? He is the man with the white hat on the horse who is like meting out something like vigilante justice, but is doing it fairly. This is a popular like fictional trope, right? But like, there was a very terrible TV show called The Sheriff. It was about like this guy who became the sheriff of LA and played by his own rules, right? So he like dealt with the bad guys got what bad guys should get, and the good guys got what good guys should get. And he knew what good guys and bad guys looked like, because he just like, was a sheriff and knew these things. Yeah, so that's kind of, it's like obvious, So like Richard Mack kind of pumps up this version of the sheriff as like, well, you are, enabled with this capacity to sort of determine for yourselves what justice looks like. And the way he sort of channels that is into saying that what sheriffs are doing is enforcing the Constitution. So like a lot of media, and I've had headlines that said this too, say something like, he says sheriffs don't have to enforce the laws, which is true, but it's a little bit of a like shorthand of what he's actually saying, because what he's actually saying is something like the sheriff is like a sort of unique figure who is interpreting the original Constitution and therefore is doing something that I actually think a lot of people sort of agree with, which is probably why this idea takes off, which is something like, well, you know what's good and bad, right? Like the little Timmy from down the street with the illegal shotgun doesn't need to go to jail, right? But outside protesters definitely do, right? So they're sort of doing this in this like imaginary small town way, and the good guys and the bad guys become sort of reflections of, I mean, honestly, what the Republican Party thinks are good guys and bad guys, to be perfectly honest. Although Mack will say they're nonpartisan. Richard Mack is very clear it is not a Republican or Democrat group. I will point out that there are no Democrats. They are all Republicans. So I think that says something about both the movement and the Republican Party.
Yeah, it talks about their righteousness, right? Because like what he's talking about here, and I think it's interesting that he's a part of this conservative strain of LDS because they, like my understanding, not having ever been a Mormon, but is that they're very focused on like patriarchs and the reproduction of like patriarchates in the church and then in the family household that sort of is being reproduced in this model of the sheriff as being the arbiter of law. It's also this very like interesting sort of Protestant, like, well, you know what's right and wrong. You don't need an arbiter. This judge like is like political and whatever else. They're like the Catholic Church. Like we have God's law handed to us in the form of the Constitution. We get to interpret this thing. And so that seems to be like that, you know, all that sort of like language aside, the sheriff as the interpreter, as opposed to the executor of the law, seems to be a place that the constitutional sheriff idea is stepping outside of the bounds of what is the recognized legal approach towards being a sheriff, right? Isn't that the job of courts?
I mean, well, I was going to say, we're kind of in a time in which I'm not clear what's law and what's... Sometimes I don't know what's what. So to be fair, everything is shifting very fast at the moment. So a lot of people might have questions about like what courts are saying as well. But I mean, the gist is everything they're saying has no basis in law whatsoever. It's literally just vibes. Some sheriffs are in their state constitutions, but so is every other elected office. So like your state constitution, you know, North Carolina state constitution has like, you will elect all these offices and here's some of their jobs. And sheriff's jobs are, you know, keeping the peace and preventing affrays and all these sorts of things, which I don't like put that much stock in what they actually mean, because most of them were written, you know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, and they all kind of borrowed the same language. Like they all sort of say the same thing, and that's just how they wrote it. And two, it doesn't give them any unique power that any other, I mean, every official who is elected has to take an oath, and they're in the state, you know, this is, and every sheriff is also regulated by laws. Like there are, in every state, there are tons and tons of laws that talk about what sheriffs and their deputies are supposed to be doing. It's all laws all over the place. So that, yeah, the kind of idea that like it's a job that's like special just doesn't hold any water. I mean, they're subject to all the same regulations and rules and laws as everybody else.
I get an impression that people are drawn to groups like the constitutional sheriffs and their frameworks out of a desire for like a devolution of what they see as a complex and large federal government structure that has like moved away from actual constitutional values. Again, vibes, right? To something more wieldy, a little bit more like libertarian in the US sense, but which actually reproduces this model of sovereignty or autocrat. Is it uncharitable, like, to hear their concerns about federal overreach and bloat as a dog whistle about anti-discrimination, voting rights, and anti-segregation laws imposed by the federal and state governments?
Oh, no, it is not. It is exactly what they're saying. I mean, they're saying the same thing that, you know, James Calhoun said, you know, before the Civil War. And actually, a lot of their doctrine is exactly the same as what secessionists like James Calhoun said. And this can sort of get to their specific doctrines, but It is anti-federal to the core. It is specifically anti-14th Amendment, which is the one I think that most courts use to argue in favor of things like non-discrimination, racial equity, etc. It is absolutely in opposition to those things. And their two main doctrines are called interposition and nullification. Nullification is rather specifically what sort of secessionists and then later ex-Confederates used to argue why they did not need to desegregate or enact any of the other federal measures that the government told them they had to do after the Civil War. So, for example, voting rights or desegregating your schools or desegregating places of business. The nullification is the general idea that if you are a local government or a state, sometimes a state government, sometimes a local government, and you don't like the law, you just say, well, like, I'm not going to enforce that law. It's called nullification. There's after the Brown versus Board Supreme Court decision, which was requiring every state to desegregate their schools. The state of Virginia specifically wrote a whole document saying, we want to nullify this law. That just meant they just didn't want to desegregate their schools. And this is like a really common tactic. Instead of saying, didn't Lee Atwater make a comment about like, you talk about states' rights instead of being overtly racist? It's basically what it is. Interposition, another one of Mac's key points, is that a sheriff can position himself between his, quote, people, and I put people in quotes because I think there's a question about what people he means, his people and the federal government. So the idea would be if, the ATF was coming to seize someone's weapons, the sheriff can protect his citizen against the evil ATF or the evil IRS. Usually it's the ATF. There's a lot of anti-ATF stuff, or the evil FBI. Or in one case, the Secret Service was coming to talk to someone who had made threats against Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi. And so the sheriff was like, no, you can't interview my citizen Secret Service without asking me first, right? This is what they call interposition, which is like the sheriff's supposed to protect the people from the federal government.
So that's interesting. So the federal government in that view is viewed as being an interlocutor as opposed to the sovereign that hands out the ability to engage law enforcement to, like, isn't there like a supremacy clause or something like that?
There is a supremacy clause. No, it's totally, it's all, like, it's nonsense. Their nullification, the Supreme Court, specifically said nullification is not a valid legal doctrine. These are not valid legal doctrines. Like, everyone, pretty much all entities agree these are not, but this is but Richard Mack again keeps bringing it up, and it does resonate with people. I was going to say, to your point about libertarian, Mack and many of his followers were avid supporters of Ron Paul. Actually, as was Stuart Rhodes. That's how they met, was volunteering for Ron Paul's campaign. So it does have its roots in that really almost extreme libertarianism. I think today that extreme libertarianism is now indistinguishable from there's so much new right and other neo-Nazi, neo-Confederate groups that sometimes it's hard to it's hard to distinguish, but that is where you were right that is exactly where it came from. That Tea Party, again, Ron Paul is very specifically a touchstone for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So naming off some of these groups, I think some of your writing, you make the point, and I could definitely see it after you did, that there's an obvious overlap between the kind of legalistic arguments as well as the framing of groups like Mac's CSPOA with the posse comitatus and sovereign citizen movements that are, that have been running since at least, I think, the 1960s, whether or not as organizations, but at least as ideologies. Could you talk a little bit about those groups and sort of you've already mentioned sort of the nullification, the ideas around the Confederate roots of that, or neo-Confederate roots of some of that, but how that plays into current neo-Confederate groups? If that's a big question, I can sort of cut that up a little bit. Sorry.
No, I was just I was just trying to think of how to do it, because it is true that a lot of these movements, like, it's funny because some, I think, feel sort of almost like retro, and then but then they sort of shift. And I do think today the political situation that Mac is operating in after 2020 is different, and it's one of the reasons why I think he experienced like this surge in popularity. It also makes him feel a lot more palatable, right? Because, you know, as opposed to many, I mean, you could listen to lots of people on the far right today, and many of the things Richard Mack says, that if you sound clip him enough, sound much more reasonable, right? So like sometimes the environment in which you're operating, his roots are less clear. But the real roots, Richard Mack basically took, like I said, influenced deeply by this sort of extremely conservative strain of Mormonism. You know, I think it's important to keep in mind that that's a lot of where it came, a great deal of where it came from. And Mac is Mormon, and most of the people on his team are. That there was a group called Posse Comitatus. So there's a fantastic book called The Terrorist Next Door that's all about the formation of Posse Comitatus, and William Potter Gale, who was the founder. I recommend it highly if you're interested in this sort of early roots of like what became the anti-government movement. But in essence, William Potter Gale in the 50s, he was sort of he was a super racist, like unquestionable, you know, neo-Nazi, super racist, not even neo-Nazi, like Nazi, you know, silver shirt Nazi guy.
Yeah, he was actually in the fascist silver shirts, since we're both in Asheville. Also, I feel a little resonance of the crystals underneath us by mentioning them.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Like, we should mention the silver shirts here. So yeah, these are still like for real, those folks. Yeah, pro-fascist silver shirt guys. So he, you know, William Potter Gale is, I mean, definitely kind of an eccentric. He kind of bounced around between wanting to be a minister and wanting to be a politician. He formed and ended up forming his own religion that became what's called the Christian identity movement, which some people might resonate. This might resonate with some people because this is getting into like, you know, the revival of kind of the neo-Klan, Idaho, you know, we're sort of getting these revivals of these like
Northwest Comparative stuff, right?
Exactly, all these really racist organizations. So he had this, basically William Potter Gale was really mad about Brown v. Board of Education, really did not think that places should have to desegregate. And he went off, he's had a newsletter that he called Identity, after Christian identity. And his religion was this, it was basically a racist religion in which white people were supreme and everybody else was terrible. And he wrote, and one of his ideas was that the sheriff should be the most important local leader. Now, one of the things that William Potter Gale was also kind of swimming in this water was this idea of localism, which sometimes comes up, which meant that, you know, in the 50s and 60s, some people in America became, you know, they got really agitated. Cities started to grow, and a lot of people living in more rural regions began to identify urban living as sort of like the rod of evil, right? Like, and some people still do, right? Urban living, it's all these people, it's all these immigrants, it's multicultural, right? And there's all this stuff going on, all these protests start happening all over the place. And so people who didn't identify with urban areas, who lived in more rural areas, got this idea that like, well, we should be able to govern ourselves. Like, why do we have to do what these city people and their city ways, as when a recent email from a sheriff made a comment about that. City people and their city ways. Why do we have to do that? We want to do what we feel like doing. And so the sheriff kind of became this like locus of kind of fantastical hope. And again, I think a lot of it does have to do with this sort of very like image and vision of it, which, as you rightly point out, is imaginary, right? Like, we picture sheriffs with a hat on a horse, like a cowboy, but that's not what cowboys were like. That's not what cowboys were like. Like, cowboys were vaqueros. They were these white guys with hats. So it's really like resonant of this idea of bringing back something that kind of never existed in the first place. And So the idea was that in a local context, the sheriff could be the one to decide what laws people should and shouldn't follow. But it really had this like very strong roots. Around this time, there was a farm crisis going on. There was a lot of like turmoil in rural America. And so a lot of people who lived in rural places were, they did have genuine upset. And there was also a leftist movement of farmers who tried to like get, better benefits and like better treatment of agricultural groups. But the sort of rights, there was sort of a leftist side of that, but this kind of posse comitatus side became the right, the right wing side of we don't want to do what they have to say. You mentioned righteousness. A lot of it was the sort of James Aho, who's this really good sociologist, calls it the politics of righteousness. Like, I don't want to do that. And they became, and from those roots came some things like sovereign citizens, the anti-tax movement. So tax resistors was like really big in the 70s and 80s, just folks who wouldn't pay their federal taxes. To be fair, like these movements were also really violent. Like Posse Comitatus sent some people, and they were everywhere in the US, not just like what we might think of as like the South or the conservative US. So for example, some agricultural workers were organizing in California. This was also the same time as like Cesar Chavez and organizing workers. And a group of Posse Comitatus adherents came to stop the workers from organizing. Now, then the real police came and were like, we don't want these Posse Comitatus guys here. And they ended up in like some kind of shootout. So like there was, shootouts, there were people hiding in sheds, people didn't want to pay their taxes, people trying to stop union organizing. Like this was like a real violent movement, particularly in the 80s. We got to the 90s, we had some events like the siege of Ruby Ridge, the Waco siege, which I could talk more about if people may or may not be as familiar, kind of culminating in the bombing of Oklahoma City, which was sort of where that movement kind of headed. So it's all kind of the same root. What happened was Richard Mack kind of revived it in like a slightly more palatable way. And again, I would add, this is the same time that Stuart Rhodes was getting politically active and many other groups. So it was sort of in a connection of this like Tea Party libertarian context just after President Barack Obama was elected. So not coincidentally, when the first Black president was elected, all these groups like spontaneously decided it was important to start organizing.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, like in the cases of Ruby Ridge and the shootout there was a lot of like questions of sovereignty and the role of the federal government, and also like connections to identitarianism or like Christian identity that the Weavers had, as well as with Waco, at least, there was a millenarian drive that was looking at the government as being the great Satan, which is, and also swimming in, like, they were modifying guns and selling them at gun shows and what have you. So bumping up against the ATF and stuff like that. And so the same stew of white nationalists, like white separatists, as well as millenarian anti-government Christian adjacent movements, right? All sort of stewing together.
That's exactly right. And actually, Richard Mack wasn't at Ruby Ridge, but he was friends with Randy Weaver. So Randy Weaver was a white separatist who lived with his family in Idaho. The FBI and federal marshals did an incredibly botched and really awful raid because of an ATF. He was in trouble with the ATF for some sawed-off shotguns. The FBI killed his son and his wife. It was really like it was awfully messed up. And Mack was a big supporter of Randy Weaver. And so he wrote an introduction. He co-wrote a book with Randy Weaver. And there's a sort of, Richard Mack at some point moved to Texas around like in the late 90s, early aughts. And he thought he might run for office in Texas, but he lost like by a landslide. But in any event, he talked to a reporter around that time and tried to persuade the reporter that Randy Weaver was not racist. Now, while the Ruby Ridge standoff was horrible, and there's not a lot of question that the federal government royally screwed up, Randy Weaver is definitely a white supremacist. So the Randy Reaver's like on the phone saying like white supremacist stuff. And Richard Mack is talking to a reporter saying, no, he doesn't mean it. He's really not that racist. He just wants to live with who he wants to live with. He has the right to like run his family as he will. And that's really, right, like that's kind of where that is. I mean, that's sort of where you end up, right? Like Richard Mack has also said things like he doesn't believe in the like accessibility. So the ADA, he's like, well, I don't see why like places have to be accessible, because if you don't want, you know, if you don't want disabled people, then you have the right not to have disabled people, right? Which is like to sort of just explain like how you get from being kind of white supremacist to also being sort of, you know.
Well, this is putting an undue burden on the small business owner for them to have wide enough sidewalks or like doorways or whatever, right? That's kind of how it gets like counterfeited through libertarian speak.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's honestly, it's just very funny. So at one point, I mean, it's not funny, like hilarious, but it's amusing because, so at one point I asked Richard Mack, so his position on access to abortion was never very clear. He doesn't talk about that much. So I asked him, I said, well, you know, if like there's localism, like can local counties decide whether or not they want women to have access to abortion? And he was all like, no, that's not, that is not how this works. So he's like, no. And he wrote me that was like, that is like against the Bible and that is not okay. So it's like, you know, sometimes people try to do it. I think sometimes there's an urge to do a sort of like both sides. So they'll be like, oh, well, Richard Mack like doesn't like, you know, handicap accessible sidewalks, but like, some sheriffs say they don't want to enforce, you know, ICE detainers. It's like absolutely not this. Like, I just want to be clear, it's absolutely not the same thing. Like Richard Mack's ideas are, you know, anti-LGBTQ, anti-woman, anti-disabled, right? Like, it's a really like white heteronormative male idea and way of looking at the world. Now, not coincidentally, sheriffs are like the whitest and malest elected position, you know, to kind of why sheriffs, and like there's a little back and forth, but like some 94% of sheriffs are white men in the United States. Very small number of women and non-white sheriffs, super small. And I haven't ever seen data on sheriffs and their religion, but I'm fairly certain like the vast majority are also Christian. Like, and I don't know how that matches up to other local politicians, to be fair, but just worth pointing out that like there is, you know, police chiefs, not scions of liberalism. Like, I'm not saying police chiefs are like a great, you know, progressive success. Police chiefs are a lot more diverse than elected sheriffs.
Yeah, well, see, police chiefs are appointed. That just goes back to the argument that like, you know, the people really want the strong white cis Christian dude to protect them. A lot of counties don't have police, so
yeah, I mean, it's interesting too because you know, there's the county is a weird unit of government. Like I grew up in cities. I didn't think that much about the county, and so sometimes I get a lot of questions from people about sheriffs and county government. You know, there's over 3,000, it's like 3,060 counties in the US. There's a lot of counties. Now, what's interesting about that is if you are familiar with like rural and urban America, so like 20% of the population lives on 80% of the land. It's like an 80-20 split. So you have this sort of like situation in which, you know, 80% of the American population lives in urban areas and cities. But 80% of the sheriffs represent rural areas. So like if you look at it that way, you can understand how sheriffs are also assigned, like the rise of the sheriff is also sort of this kind of like the electoral college, like an overrepresentation problem of, again, like sort of white heteronormative masculinity as like they don't represent a lot of people, they represent a lot of land.
But they also have like they have their own supremacy clause sort of thing, or like there's jurisdiction. Like most cities are incorporated into counties, and so evictions occur through sheriff's departments, interagency, like and like connection to federal or state level law enforcement often comes through sheriff's departments, and they're the ones that tend to run the jails, except for outside of like very large cities, right?
That's exactly right. So this is sort of shifting away from the constitutional sheriff movement for a little bit. It's interesting because Mac talks very little about all these other functions of sheriffs, but I do like to point them out because, you know, for every sheriff who claims to be a far right, you know, constitutional style sheriff, there's like a very real jail with very real people in it subject to this person's whim. Yes, sheriffs are, I think, like 85% of sheriffs run a jail. You're right, there's a handful of places where they don't. West Virginia, I think, elects jailers that are separate from sheriffs. But they run the jail. They have pretty much discretion over everything, including like how people eat, what kind of medical care they get, do they get blankets, right? Like all this stuff. So they really are like often taking care of people in incredibly dire situations. They do most evictions in most places. Some are a little different. It's actually, the eviction one is an interesting question. It's actually hard to get data on evictions and who's doing them because I tried, and it's very scatterplot. There's not very good data on it.
That's just where I had experienced or where I had lived, I guess, is what I was working off an assumption from.
It's correct in most places. It just depends. It's like, it's kind of, but it can vary even within the same like state. So it's like you could have a state like North Carolina and it could be different from like city to city, not even county to county. It's kind of wild. And they also tend to do a lot of other administrative things. So like a lot of them handle handgun permitting. That's like one big job of most sheriff's offices. Some of them do like really random stuff. Like they might be in charge of like animals, either wildlife or like animals that get like animal control type
stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of like a dog catcher stuff. Immigration is another big area where they have a lot of discretion. And so it's kind of a weird, like it still is a weird hybrid role of like administrative stuff. Running a jail is largely administrative. I mean, it's like I have advocated for a long time that you should not have like law enforcement officers running jails, which are basically hold a lot of people with like extreme medical needs. That's not like a job for someone who's like calling is to be like a tough guy.
And frequently like before any sort of like court case or conviction of a crime in the first place too, right?
Yeah. I mean, it could be it's everybody. It's anyone and everyone. Just they could be there for a long time, short time. And I think also just to sort of actually flag on the jail part, the other reason why the sheriffs run jail is important is because in that sort of post-Reconstruction era when many states brought back convict leasing. So convict leasing was done on a statewide scale, so kind of famously places like Mississippi and Alabama. But as the government, as state governments and the federal government less or so began to crack down on sort of statewide convict leasing, individual sheriffs did convict leasing for a very long time and still do. They do a version of it still in many places. They can sort of lease people in their jail to for-profit companies. And sheriffs were really integral to this in the places where this existed because they could essentially disappear people off the street and then lease their labor that they would profit from. The sheriff's office has always traditionally kind of had this like for-profit flair. So they would rent them out, and they were then not responsible for their welfare, but also not responsible for kind of like, there was never really like trials or figuring out what happened, or it was none of that. It was really just people vanished and no one knew where they were. So like, I don't want to like underplay the fact that sheriffs were integral to the system that was incredibly cruel, incredibly dangerous. About a third of people who were leased out and died, just like brutal conditions, horrible work, and I think for that reason alone, like sheriffs shouldn't be running jails just because the abuses have been so severe. But even today, there are places where sheriffs can, in Louisiana, people are, quote, leased out to do things like disaster repair. People have abused it by doing things. There was a guy in Texas who used to like ask the guys in his jail to like help him set up barbecues. like at his house. He's like, hey, can y'all come and like help me set up this barbecue? Like as if they sort of were like masters of their own,
Yeah.
mini workforce, like as if they could boss people around just because they're the sheriff.
Well, and then they can give like preferential treatment to the people that are willing to do that sort of work or promise good time off. But even like if you want to talk about like here in the Asheville area, there was a pretty good series of stories in the Mountain Express a few years back about about like documenting convict lease and the amount of mostly black men that were killed constructing the railroad through Swannanoa, like and the tunnels there. And when we're saying people, like because this was a continuation of slavery and because convict leasing was the like pre-Jim Crow sort of application of slavery under the state format, it's good to point out that these were mostly people of color that were suddenly convicted off of new crimes like loitering crimes that were being applied either specifically or just in practice against black and brown populations, indigenous populations, like a continuation of the same stuff that was going on before, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in the South, we are primarily talking about black men. If you go west, you do get like different versions of it, right? Like in Arizona, you would get more Latino men or Native Americans, but it was absolutely just a recapitulation. It was, as the book is, slavery under another name. But we're not, I think I guess the reason why I put such a big point on it is, well, one, we're not that far away from it, and two, it still happens. So like, I think it's like important to sort of say like this like pretty much still happens, and I don't see a lot of folks arguing that it shouldn't. So I just think it's important to point out that
And the leasing out like isn't the only part of it too, because you've got prisons, you've got jails. For good behavior, people can go pick up trash by the side of the road or do administrative functions or serve in the cafeteria or do these other things that cut the administrative costs of the county government. So in a lot of ways, sheriff can get elected not only on a tough on crime, but giving job training to these like fallen people in our community, as well as cutting the operational costs, because we've got certainly not unionizable positions, like doing free labor based on the amount of people that are picked up by deputies during a period of time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They work in the office. They do they do paperwork. They do, all sorts of stuff. Also never mind that it, as you rightly point out, this sort of loose patronage system is of course ripe for abuse. There's just a series of stories in the New York Times about a Mississippi sheriff who essentially would have sex with women in exchange for letting them go home for the day or, work in an office job instead of sit in their cells. So like it's any system like this is ripe for gross abuses that are often very hard to detect, because people who are being charged with crimes or have been in jail, they're not believed. And also it's very hard. I also want to sort of say it's very hard for people to talk about this. Like in many places, especially rural places where sheriffs kind of operate with the most lack of oversight, these are real people who, when they say something, these sheriffs have really, very powerful defenders that will go after them extremely vigorously. It can be very scary to be chased down by your sheriff.
Yeah, especially if they know your name and they're like after you.
But yeah, sure. They know your address. It's scary.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Welcome to Molotov Now, a podcast about taking action.
In Molotov Now, we analyze and discuss news articles and stories of resistance from around the globe and connect them to our struggles here at home in Aberdeen, Washington.
In the spirit of building solidarity between the rural and the urban, we hope to inspire direct action in the face of oppression and to light a fire to find each other in the darkness.
Back to the group organizing the gathering in Cherokee. Can you talk a bit about the ties between Sam Bushman, the CEO of CSPOA, I think, unless I'm wrong on that, if it's not Mac anymore?
I think Sam Bushman has officially become the has officially become the CEO. So there was a bit of a, this is sort of like inside baseball, but there was a bit of a shakeup around the end of 2022 in which Matt kind of announced that he was going to take a step back. Now, I want to say this too, like it's interesting because the organization is changing. Richard Mack is getting old. I mean, he's had like a few heart attacks. He is just genuinely like getting old, and his style is old. You know, he is, like I said, he's not social media savvy. He lacks a lot of the like flair of the new right. So Sam Bushman has, I think, stepped up as the CEO of operations. He is basically, as far as I can tell, essentially like a neo-Confederate. He runs this radio station called Liberty Roundtable that is in essence like a sort of white supremacist radio station where he hosts a lot of guests with those views. He famously, I think, went to a neo-Confederate gathering. Yeah, I mean, he is quite plainly just like allied with neo-Confederates. There's another figure who appears quite a lot too, and I don't know if he's going to be at this particular event. He appears with Richard Mack quite a lot. His name is Michael Peroutka. Michael Peroutka is a lawyer. In a sort of depressing twist of where we are today, he ran for attorney general in Maryland, like for real. Lost, but was the actual GOP candidate for attorney general, which is sort of scary. Michael Peroutka runs an organization in which he essentially argues a version of like neo-Confederate law. He used to belong to a white supremacist organization. There's a clip of him online singing Dixie. He is another one who's just, I mean, in my view, there's not much, there's not a lot of quibbling to say that they're very sympathetic to those particular views. And I think it's important to point out that Mack is pretty aware. He used to also have an individual on his team who was a real anti-Semite. And he knows, like, I've seen correspondence in which someone might complain to Richard Mack about one of these figures. Like, they might say something like, someone said this and I don't really agree. And Mack will say like, well, he said this, but he meant that. Like, he'll sort of defend them a bit like he defended Randy Weaver as like, well, he's not very good with words, but he's not actually racist. So Richard Mack himself does quite a bit of minimizing, but I also think that as Richard Mack steps back, we might see like a more virulently racist version emerge, because it's not clear to me who's gonna take charge, and a lot of the people in his circle are of that ilk.
With Bushman and these other folks that are sort of taking the reins of the CSPOA that's going to be holding this event in Cherokee, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about their explicit sharing of space and organizing that they've done alongside of groups like League of the South. Like, you covered them in an article sharing space with Identity Dixie and some other groups in South Carolina in July of this year, right?
Yeah, so in July of this year, there was an event at Travelers Rest in South Carolina. And as Sam Bushman said, they were, quote unquote, celebrating the South. So he was there. He actually broadcast his show from there. And he participated in this neo-Confederate group called Dixie Republic. I think it was an event that was hosted for a bunch of other white nationalist groups. That's my impression, is this event in Travelers Rest has historically always been a group that's hosted League of the South places and Identity Dixie and these variety of people. And so, he was there. He was certainly involved, and he talked about it openly. He said specifically it was not a CSPOA event, but again, he was certainly there and talked about it.
What has been learned about the CSPOA and the Constitutional Sheriff movement as relates to participation in the January 6, 2021 attempted coup to keep Trump in office and to overturn the 2020 election? I'm sure if they're making points so far about sheriffs having the right and agency and responsibility to only follow just laws, and if there are arguments being made about the non-constitutionality of the Biden administration or the current electoral system that causes like a rift that they can take advantage of. And then I know that like you've written about how the CSPOA also relates to oath keepers. You mentioned Stuart Rhodes, who got a conviction out of this cases around January 6th already.
Yes. So they have, I want to say, first of all, that Richard Mack has certainly adopted quote unquote election integrity as one of his causes, and many sheriffs have. This was a large part of Mack's revival. So Richard Mack and Stuart Rhodes met, back in the 2010s, again, largely through Ron Paul. When Stuart Rhodes formed the Oath Keepers, he did ask Richard Mack to be a board member. This was around 2014. And Richard Mack was there. There was sort of this big, hubbub when Stuart Rhodes announced the formation of the Oath Keepers. And Richard Mack was there and spoke, and they were very close. Now, it does seem Richard Mack defends himself by saying he left the Oath Keepers and wasn't that friendly with Stuart Rhodes. From what I can tell, this does appear to be true. It does appear that at a certain point before January 6th, Richard Mack kind of gently parted ways with Stuart Rhodes. I want to say also, in addition to his other legal troubles, Stuart Rhodes was in the middle of this he had a really acrimonious divorce and protective order from his ex-wife, who has alleged a variety of abuse from Stuart Rhodes. And Richard Mack is basically refused to testify against Stuart Rhodes in any of these. Like, he won't say anything bad about Stuart Rhodes, and he says that repeatedly. I think that, in terms of January 6th, to be clear, Richard Mack wasn't there, and I believe him. He claims that he always knew January 6th was a false flag operation. Now, which is why he wasn't there. Now, a lot of the people in his circuit and sheriffs who agree with him were not there, tangentially involved. So there was one sheriff who was there January 6th, who was an Oklahoma sheriff named Chris West. Chris West is in a leadership position in the National Sheriff's Association. Just to put a tag on that, but the National Sheriff's Association never said anything about the fact that one of their leadership members was present on January 6th. And there, it's not clear to what extent other sheriffs were there. A lot of the sheriffs were there speaking in their home counties. So Sheriff Mark Lamb, who's now running for Senate, he's kind of created his own constitutional sheriff style group. He gave a big speech at the rally that was in Phoenix and kind of defended January 6th. So a lot of them later defended it as like, we don't know what happened and who's to be sure. Both Richard Mack and Sheriff Mark Lamb adopted partnerships with the group called True the Vote, which was involved in the Dinesh D'Souza movie and has basically spread conspiracy theories regarding the election. They have both toured. Richard Mack has toured specifically on what he calls quote unquote election integrity. He believes the 2020 election was probably quote stolen. He thinks that Democrats will probably do it again in 2024. He thinks sheriffs should be entitled to investigate voter fraud, no matter what the law or other officials say. So he's also generated a lot of, he's kind of inspired these like rogue sheriffs to run around and investigate non-existent voter fraud in their counties. He also kind of inspired a lot of sheriffs to do a lot of threats, crackdowns, kind of armed vigilantes manning boxes. So I do think like his real harm in that capacity has been like to sort of inspire these like kind of quasi-rogue kind of terror missions that are bound to simply make it harder for people, especially people of color, to vote. So, he's kind of prepping for that. The other thing Richard Mack has been prepping for lately is encouraging sheriffs to prosecute health officials who give out COVID vaccines as like, kind of like a form of manslaughter. So that might be something to look forward to. And Richard Mack has also talked quite a lot about the concern that Democrats are encouraging immigration. This has been his sort of one of the issues that he's talked quite a lot about in the past few years has been sort of perceived increase in immigration, and that the Democrats are encouraging immigration in order to increase their voter rolls so that they can win in 2024. This is sort of his, quasi. So there's, he sort of spawns these varieties of conspiracy theories around all sorts of election integrity type stuff.
Because that's how that works. People come into the country and they could just vote automatically. That's a really clear understanding of how the legal system operates.
It really just honestly though, I just wrote a short piece about this, but honestly it's white replacement theory. She's just arguing that the same, he's really just regurgitating like these same old racist arguments, but kind of putting it in this, but like unfortunately, COVID, we sort of had Trump, COVID, and then the election sort of gave them these like convenient slots that motivated a lot of people, right? A lot of people got really motivated about COVID and vaccines and like government orders. And so it really gave him this like opportunity to revive and sort of put his ideas back out there to a receptive audience who had this kind of like contemporary container to put it in. So like COVID vaccines felt like federal, could be seen as federal overreach. And the same with sort of voter integrity, right? It's just, honestly, it's just racism that he can kind of put into another container that people feel primed to accept.
All right. So the CSPOA is like framed, as you said before, as like this training and educational opportunity for law enforcement. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, this is advertised for sheriffs by sheriffs, but are there other like non-law enforcement participants? Do local police participate in this? Can you talk a little bit about where cops have been able, or deputies or whatever, have been able to get federal funding for attending these classes and registering it as a continuing education, that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So as I said, his main sort of recruitment pitch are these training classes. And it's a little interesting as a concept because one, what I realized when I looked into it, so about, I think 6 states at this point have made it available for continuing education credits. I, in particular, was looking at Texas, which had made it available for continuing education credits and then stopped because people were investigating. So, one of the things that's interesting about continuing training for police officers or all law enforcement officers is that it's not very well regulated in most states. This is probably not a surprise. But in many places, they let local sheriffs or police departments decide what sort of trainings they want to host. And then you sort of fill out a form and you get credit. So to be clear, when they say they're getting credit, it's not because like a state official like conscientiously reviewed the information and was like, I give it a stamp. It's because the way in which they do all trainings is this sort of like, whatever you guys think is good is good. And so if a sheriff's office sponsors a training and there's like a certificate you fill out and they're like, yes, you're going to get credit for it. Now, Texas withdrew the certification of the training because they sent investigators to talk to people and actually read the syllabus, which is laughable because Mac has this syllabus that's like 1 page long. And it's like, liberty. I teach officers about the Constitution and liberty. So, the reason why Texas rejected the training and the reason why it shouldn't be training is because it's not training. And I'm not really I don't want to defend law enforcement training because a lot of training is probably not good. But, there's all sorts of training. There's that guy who goes around and teaches the like bulletproof cop training and the, wolves and sheep training. And like, there's all sorts of militaristic type trainings that I would probably rather not have as well. But the way in which Mac's training differentiates is that he's actually not teaching any skills or any laws. He really just preaches his vision of the Constitution and his vision of what sheriffs should be. And truly, it's more like a church service. One of the Texas sheriffs called it like an old-fashioned revival, which is kind of what it reminds me of. I don't know if you guys have it here, but like in Texas, they have these things called cowboy churches, which are like the man version of church, where like you go in your hat and you like sit outside and listen to a preacher. It's supposed to be like more masculine. They kind of remind me of these like cowboy churches, because like the sheriffs sit in their hats and like listen to Richard Mack talk about the Constitution.
It sounds really gentlemanly. No, I don't. I might have it here. Maybe it's in like Murfreesboro. I'm not sure, or like Murphy, not Murfreesboro. Sorry, Murfreesboro.
The cowboy church thing. I was like, what's up with these cowboy churches? I was like, oh my god, this is what these guys all do.
That's so Texas. Come on.
It's very Texas, but like it's just this. It is very, I mean, it is like really masculine. So we do know that most of these trainings are open to the public and any law enforcement officer, and he will welcome anybody. Now, I talk about Texas more specifically because I got a lot of their, I got their rolls of like who attended and stuff, so I could like more closely look at who was actually there. And the folks who were there ranged from some county commissioners, some sheriff deputies, constables, which I'm not sure if you have here, but it's another law enforcement agency. So you might get a variety of law enforcement types. You also do get quite a number of just civilian folks. In general, at all these trainings, Mac starts with a sort of sermon, and then he kind of divides the law enforcement officers from the non-law enforcement officers, and then they sort of get separate programs. The law enforcement officer program, I could say, I have heard it, so I know what he says. But he basically goes through the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, so the Bill of Rights. In a lot of these sort of traditionalist, constitutionalist varieties of thought, the first 10 amendments are considered part of the quote-unquote original Constitution. So a lot of times when they say Constitution, it's worth remembering that they only think of the original Constitution, not like all the other amendments that came after. And he'll sort of go through his version of like the first, the second, the third, the fourth, he'll go through like all these rights and sort of talk about how he thinks law enforcement officers should behave. It's interesting because it's like this sort of philosophical training, which is why I often liken it to like a religious type training, because he's sort of giving them ideas, but I want to be clear, there's no discussion of cases, of laws, no discussion of any Supreme Court case except Mac's case, which he will talk about all the time, which is probably worth just putting a flag in that Richard Mack was one of the sheriff plaintiffs in a case that became known as the Prince case, which was decided in 1995. It was written by Anthony Scalia. And it was a case that basically started the idea that there's an individual Second Amendment right to bear arms. It's kind of one of those cases that's like in the scheme of Supreme Court cases that got us to where we are today. So Mac talks quite a lot about his case. He has it in a little pamphlet that you can get the pamphlet and read. The Prince case, which does not say what he says it says, but it is a real case. And to this day, Scalia is the only Supreme Court judge that Richard Mack will say anything nice about. That particular case was also against the Clintons for the Brady Bill. So he will also talk a lot about how much he can't stand the Clintons. It's like but this also feels very, right, like retro, far right, like still beating on the Clintons.
Yeah, he's going to start talking about Whitewater or whatever after that, right?
He absolutely does. He will talk about the Clinton crime family and just like keep. And they're like, I don't even know that some of these people know. I'm like, I think a lot of the younger far right like is not aware of the context of all this, but that I think is just part of where he's coming from. So it's kind of weird. And it also is kind of interesting because it leads him to some weird libertarian places. Like he, for example, doesn't support civil asset forfeiture. He will say that what's interesting is he'll say, well, we shouldn't seize weapons or money from people if they haven't been convicted. Now, what's interesting about it is when he talks about that, he uses only federal examples. So he'll bring up examples of the ATF seizing weapons, which they do, or the DEA seizing money. So he'll bring up only federal, and IRS, right, will seize money too. So he'll bring up examples in which federal agencies have seized things from people, but he sort of like forgets the fact that county sheriffs also do this. Actually, on the regs.
All the time.
It's like a regular practice of almost every sheriff's office is to seize cars and money and houses and whatever. So he kind of only brings up the federal examples and then backs off. Or, like freedom of religion. He'll talk about the closure of churches during COVID and how this evil state governments did it. But he doesn't bring up, for example, not allowing Christian prayer in schools, because that, I think we could also say like, oh, well, that's also free exercises. You have to let all religions participate. You can't just have like a dominant religion. No, none of that. Right. So it's just, he has all like a twist, but it does have this like sometimes interesting libertarian style twist that gets you to these places. But I do think it's important to point out that his examples are always the federal government overstepping the Constitution, not like local sheriffs doing it.
So CSPOA being like this, like you've talked about how the education framework allows for like the dissemination of these ideas and then also supporting of individual like rogue sheriffs around, that you do some work to document on your blog, for instance, because there's a sort of overlap around this sort of thing and between the pushing of this ideology among law enforcement officials. And we've talked about stuff during the militia or like patriot movement of the 1990s or 80s shootouts with tax resistors in the federal government. Is there any sort of concern or any studies that you've seen around sheriffs with this sort of ideology using like 1033 programs or like other federal programs to be able to get access to like funding or like literally like decommissioned military weapons? But I don't know, when I think about like the Malheur Ranch standoff or other libertarian like standoffs with larger government entities, it seems like the arguments that were being made by the libertarians that were engaging in the standoffs there fall in line with what's being pushed by CSPOA, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Bundys were...
Bundys, thank you.
The Bundy family. Yeah, no. Richard Mack was... I don't remember if he was at Malheur. He was more closely involved, I think, in the original one standoff that was in Nevada. He was there. So Richard Mack is also a friend of Cliven Bundy. He's on their team. They are also LDS, is non-coincidentally. So yes, he absolutely would agree with him. Now it's kind of interesting because in terms of the military equipment, like Richard Mack is actually not a military equipment guy. Like he's not telling sheriffs like, go get a bunch of tanks, do tank stuff. Like Richard Mack will say that he is sort of anti-violence, and to some extent, like, while he supports an individual right to bear guns and is kind of a gun nut, he doesn't really encourage law enforcement offices to militarize. That said, the current, the way police operate now and the 1033 program really makes it very beneficial and easy for sheriff's offices and police offices to get that equipment that they can use however they want. So it is certainly true that a lot of sheriffs affiliated with constitutional sheriff movements or other far-right movements will certainly get their equipment and then use their equipment to sort of, drive their tank and just like use it to scare people, like, protesters or something. So I think what's interesting is you've got this this is what I think is the particularly dangerous confluence, is that we are in a time in which police, law enforcement, and sheriffs get an extremely large amount of money. They have a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of weaponry, any weaponry they want, and that they could use however they want. And then you have this individual who's telling them, like, you know what, God is with you and you should do whatever you want. So like, that is a terrible confluence of things, that you already have law enforcement officers that act with impunity. And then you're telling them, you have more impunity than you thought you did, because Mack's vision is like a holy vision. Like there's no like law or Supreme Court ruling that can dissuade someone if they think they're on the side of the good. And then they get, and this is one where sometimes if we talk about like what folks could do, like this is what I think genuinely everybody is sort of, we're all, I think, involved in this idea of like advancing police and giving them money. Like Joe Biden gave police lots of money, And he does not, there is no rule that says like a constitutional sheriff can't get money. Yeah, they don't do that. They get whatever they want. So, I don't know. I'm just suggesting like maybe if someone says they don't like the federal government, they shouldn't be allowed to get like federal goodies. But that's just me. Like that's like an easy one that I think you could do is like if you have a sheriff who says he doesn't think the law applies to everybody, I don't see why he should get like more money and equipment. But that's that's on both political parties, to be fair.
Yeah. And then also, and I didn't bring up in there, but there's also other resources that aren't that, you mentioned the money, there's the guns that law enforcement can take advantage of that comes from a federal level. But then there's also like access to intelligence, like paragovernmental intelligence sources like fusion centers or shared dual roles with FBI, ICE, ATF, like these sort of federal agencies. How do they play with those sorts of things? Like have you heard of any examples where they've been able to weaponize information that they've accumulated from one of these fusion centers?
So I have not heard of that. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I will confess, like I am not the biggest expert at fusion centers. I do think two things. I think one, that probably comes into context when you're targeting protesters. So my guess is if you're talking, one of the great other sort of factors that helped Richard Mack's ideas kind of bleed into the mainstream were the George Floyd protests. And I think a lot of people probably know that a lot of Black Lives Matter's protesters were being surveilled. And I don't have a lot of reason to think that people don't have access to that information. Now, it's sort of interesting is like we do have examples of various constitutional aligned sheriffs who, of course, like made a lot of threats about Black Lives Matter. Like I went to some rally, they had their militia and they were like, let's see if some Black Lives Matter protesters come. It was rural Nevada. There were no Black Lives Matter protesters in miles, hundreds of miles. So like it kind of is almost like a boogeyman. Like they're very fond of using the news to create a boogeyman. What they do inspire a lot of, I think right now that's a great threat is this vigilante style violence. One of the things that sheriffs bridge is this idea of official law enforcement and unofficial law enforcement. So I think of a lot of these incidents in which folks have just gone to the streets with their guns, especially far right groups have gone to the street saying like, we're going to protect our nice citizens and help the sheriff. And that sort of gets into the idea of the sheriff's ability to raise a posse. This is like one of what if Mac's other favorite things is that, this is true, under most state laws, sheriffs have the technical ability to raise a posse. Raising a posse is basically like you gather up, in the olden days, you would gather up the men of the town and say, we're going to go get the bad guys. And it's basically a militia. And there's a quote of Mac saying, I use the word posse, not militia, because people don't like militias. So there is a lot of evidence that like sheriffs are partnering with militia type groups because they have a lot of sympathy with them. It's kind of interesting because some of it seems to be like the militias will often go to the sheriff to ask for permission. So there was just these emails between the Secret Service and Stuart Rhodes where they did the same thing. So the militia will go to the sheriff and say, hey, we want to have this like protest and we heard there's going to be this protest and we want to bring our guys so we can like protect the good people of the town from outsiders. And the sheriff might say like, well, I don't know if I'm like really into this, but also I don't know if I can stop you and you vote for me. So sure, why not? Like sometimes the sheriffs are kind of like lukewarm, but they'll be like, fine. Like I need your votes, so go forth. And they sort of like there's one study that shows that basically like sheriffs take a pleasant view of militias, of white militias, and then have like negative views of protesters of color. Like they just like white. They think white militias are like they're not doing any harm. They're just walking around. what are they that bad? You know, are the Oath Keepers so bad? They seem fine. It's like this sort of like is it just bias or is it like affinity? I'm not sure, but I think that's one of the things we're going to start to see is them almost encouraging this kind of violence because sheriffs are so heavily invested in the idea of like a Second Amendment right for everybody. Like everybody has the right to bear arms. Now, I always add the caveat on that because my comment is sheriffs are very into a Second Amendment individual right to bear arms. However, I do not see them advocating anywhere for example, all the people on Rikers Island in New York or the people in the jail at Chicago to be released who are there on handgun possession. They are not advocating for like men of color who have handguns to be released from jail and prison. They're advocating for white men to have guns, not, you know, so it's like another one where they say, oh, it's about individual right to guns, but like, let's be clear, individuals mean something pretty specific.
Yeah, they definitely mean Kyle Rittenhouse.
Yes, they mean Kyle Rittenhouse. They do not mean, like I said, the, you know, tens of thousands of teenagers who end up in jail because they have, or people think they have, or folks think they have handguns.
I wonder how that sort of, I mean, yeah, Oath Keepers, like, I don't know if we've said, but like was an organization or has been an organization claiming to be made up of law enforcement and either current or former law enforcement or military who are putting themselves in a position to uphold the Constitution. That's the oath that they're like protecting. Not to get too much off on a tangent, but like in North Carolina, there's a law about coming armed to the terror of the public, which was used. It's like an anti-Klan law, much like a lot of the South has like anti-mask laws for going to demonstration with masks on that get applied to all sorts of people. But they, you know, which was like in some ways like a reason that Klan have started like shifted to military fatigues at a certain point. But like I know in 2020 here, there was a demonstration after the street got repainted with some BLM content and people reacting to that were coming down to try to paint over it and people were going to defend it. And then people from the right showed up with open carry assault rifles. And that's what they were charged with, was this like coming to armed to the terror of the public. So I wonder in that sort of instance, if there's no official deputization that happens in one of these states where that law is on the books, like how that plays out.
They have threatened it. I mean, a lot of sheriffs have something like that they often call a volunteer posse. And here I'll confess, like, I don't know in Cherokee County what Heat has. But they are empowered to create something like a volunteer posse. Most volunteer posses, to be honest, are retired law enforcement officers who like, you know, they do like crowd control at parades. Like a lot of them are pretty harmless. Sometimes though, people create very large posses. So like a few constitutional style sheriffs like are fond of creating like 100 to 200 member posses that they say they'll deploy to like, you know, quell riots or something. If you think all the way back to Joe Arpaio of Arizona, one of the more famous constitutional sheriffs, like he had such a massive posse and he sent them to do all sorts of stuff like prostitution stings and like traffic stop. I mean, all sorts of stuff that like, honestly, you're not supposed to let people do. A few sheriffs have occasionally said if assault weapons get banned by the state, that they'll, quote, deputize every man in their county to carry an assault weapon. I mean, I don't know if you could actually, it depends on how small your county is, I guess. I suppose technically. So sometimes they use that kind of rhetoric, like, I'll deputize these people and then they can carry their assault rifles, which is probably not technically true, but then I'm like, I guess anyone can just be a part of the posse. Yeah,
probably not much of a paper trail in that.
Yeah, it depends on the place. Like I see a lot of crossover between formal and informal. And some of this is honestly, like we've talked a little bit about like the way law enforcement operates in this country. Some of it is honestly like law enforcement in this country is fragmented and kind of not held to like particularly high standards. So like sometimes things are just not accounted for because no one's ever asked them to do it. Like there's no law enforcement agency I know that will track anything unless someone comes in and is like, you have to do that. So some of this is just like the general, like, I do what I want attitude. And then when it comes to sheriffs, it's sort of like double that, especially a sheriff of a more rural county is just like, who will ask? Now, there are places where sheriffs like keep the roles of their posses and they're supposed to screen the posse for various things. But anti-government attitudes is not one of them. Mm-hmm. So,
well, in terms of like the kind of accountability that sheriffs can be expected to, like, you've noted how difficult it is to like the amount of impunity that law enforcement often has, and specifically when talking police, you're talking about the hierarchy in that department and maybe the oversight that they have from a mayor or city manager. Or some other like civil institution, city manager being an unelected position in Asheville, at least, that's I think assigned by the city council for terms. But in the case of sheriffs, like where there is known instances of the sheriff, like where the sheriff is like pretty well known to be doing some pretty dastardly things, what sort of accountability is there besides just not voting them in and voting someone else in instead?
So I think that's like one of the huge issues about sheriffs is sort of, regardless of their like far right or constitutional sheriff thing, is the fact that sheriffs are kind of hard to oversee. So as you point out, like first to properly point out that like most law enforcement officers in the United States, like oversight is pretty, it's pretty bad. They get more allotments than they get oversight. Because sheriffs are elected, they're often considered like on equal footing with other elected officials. So like in the official county hierarchy, county managers or your county prosecutor will say, well, I can't tell the sheriff what to do because we're like all on the same level. So it's kind of like they're equal to the other elected officials and can't tell them what to do. So that's like a sort of structural problem because it's an elected office. Now, the biggest problem with sheriff elections, and I do think some people have really pushed sheriff elections as a way to hold them accountable. Sheriff elections are really difficult. One, because honestly, most incumbents win. I think it's like a 70 to 80% incumbents win. And two is like the way counties are often structured. They're structured in a way such that the votes of kind of rural areas will often dominate. And so you sort of you have this situation in which the sheriff is being elected by not the people who are being policed by that sheriff. So, and plus like not everyone could vote. And there's all sorts of problems with like who can vote. If you're in jail and you are eligible to vote, you can only vote if the sheriff lets you, basically. So that's like another thing is folks in jail don't always get access to the ballot. I think, one of the things, though, that people can do is they can always demand accountability. I think that people want to look for like an official mechanism. So they'll look for something like a recall, which the laws on recall vary quite a lot. And, they'll look for other methods like prosecution. The problem is like most sheriff behavior is maybe not rises to the level of crime, but is certainly people could be, I think people can demand more than that their sheriff doesn't commit crimes, right? People have the right to demand accountability. And I think a lot of it is honestly like pressure from the community about what they want. Like, what do people want to see from their law enforcement and how do people want them to behave? I do think like that kind of pressure does a lot. And the other thing to bear in mind is that most sheriffs' budgets are approved by the county commission. So another pressure point is often to pressure point them on their budget and how they're getting their money, where is their money going, what are they doing? So I think that that's like another place where like the people in a community can demand more accountability in terms of the budgeting process and asking other county representatives to sort of demand that like the sheriff account for what he's doing with his time and money.
You mentioned earlier the sort of argument made by constitutional sheriffs around the autonomy of sheriffs to choose to enact or not enact certain laws at the federal level based on the justice of these. I know that like the immigrants' rights movement has locally here and in other places around the country applied pressure since the transition from the INS to ICE for immigration enforcement to persuade sheriffs to refuse participation in the deputization of local authorities, local law enforcement into immigration enforcement on behalf of the federal government. Like basically making the argument that in a lot of cases, like, A, we're not budgeted for this, and B, this actually breaks down whatever trust does exist. Like if somebody might want to report a domestic abuse situation, but they're afraid of getting deported, or that even that the person perpetrating it against them, for instance, might get deported, if not both parties, they're less likely to participate. And law enforcement does require some level of participation from the like civilians in their area, no matter what their legal like immigration status is. So a lot of law enforcement have argued against participation in the deputization of their forces on behalf of these immigration laws. But I wonder, like, I don't know how that sort of jives with the concerns around constitutional sheriffs and the arguments that they're making. If you could just kind of play with that a little bit.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It is good to point out, especially in North Carolina, right? There was a great success in motivating communities to vote for sheriffs who agreed not to partner with ICE. Like that, it was a great strategy in North Carolina and worked pretty well. And I think it particularly worked well because the Trump administration was so cruel to immigrants that people were, I think, more aware and alert to that concern. And so it sort of inspired more political action than might otherwise.
Oh, but I even saw this happening back, like I moved here during Obama. And yeah, they were successful in that during that time too, just to cut in.
Good. I mean, it's good. I mean, it's been like, I do agree. This has been the most like successful sort of election strategy has been the immigration one, especially in North Carolina, which was kind of like the birthplace of like partnering with ICE. I think, I mean, there's a lot of sort of news that will do the both sides part and be like, but some of these sheriffs don't cooperate with ICE, and that's like a constitutional sheriff. I disagree with that, and the reason being that in the first place, whether or not you cooperate with ICE is like in the first place, the immigration system is really complex, and to be honest, it's pretty hard for law enforcement not in some way to have some sort of communication with immigration services at this point. Under Obama, he created the Secure Communities system, which basically means that every time someone gets booked into a jail, ICE is alerted if that person pops up on ICE. Now, that person could pop up for a variety of reasons, but some of this is automated and there's not a whole lot that any individual can do. That gets a little like buried sometimes, but that's just sort of a symbol of how like the crimmigration system is thoroughly integrated into society. I think because there is no law that says that sheriffs, that like local law enforcement has to cooperate with ICE. And two is because this is again an instance in which, you know, the sort of immigration enforcement grew and became much more invested in incarceration and arrest than it once was. It was just not a system that was this reliant upon the criminal legal system and this sort of process of like incarcerating and arresting so many people. So and three, honestly, the whole constitutional sheriff thing is all about resisting federal power for the benefit of white supremacy. And I just don't think that applies when it comes to, I just like don't think that philosophically applies when it comes to immigration. To be clear, Richard Mack has never said that he thinks sheriffs should not cooperate with Border Patrol or ICE. And he is extremely anti-immigrant. So that's one of those places where, you know, his anti-federalism sort of fails a little. You'll also see lately a lot of states like Texas have been saying that there's a state right to enforce immigration law, which there isn't, but that's what they're saying anyway. So I think that's been a really good electoral strategy. And I think that the immigrant rights movement has been correct to sort of target that as a place. I think that what's hard about it is like, it's kind of hard just because immigration is so wrapped up in so much criminalization and incarceration. And really the best way for everyone is to simply reduce incarceration and reduce the power of sheriffs. What I haven't seen is any sheriff running on, I want less power, which I would accept. But I haven't seen anyone say it.
It's a good start. Yeah.
I would like less power, and I want to incarcerate fewer people, and I want a smaller jail, and I want to do less. Because truly the way to reduce deportations and folks being worried about deportation is to honestly just arrest, is you need to involve the cops less, because that's how people get entered into the system. And it truly is terrifying because there's this amount of randomness to it. Like whether or not you get flagged and whether or not ICE decides that you're worth their time. ICE doesn't follow up on most of it gets a sort of like ping, and it doesn't follow up on all of it. Because it's just, some of it depends on the priorities set by the president, and some of it is they just like don't have enough time. So but truly, in a way, I think that randomness makes it more terrifying for people because you really don't know. And there's all sorts of cases of like mistakes being made and like people get lost in the system, and which is truly horrific. So, I mean, I would love for it to be disentangled more, but I think the root of the issue is that we need just like that much less reliance on arrest and incarceration, because that just like funnels so many people into so many systems.
Yeah. So at this point, North Carolina doesn't appear to give that sort of educational credit to CSPOA classes. And it like, I wonder... So that's not necessarily that's one point for those of us here to be paying attention to, that possibility coming up. But I wonder, with this event coming up in Cherokee, what are some good ways for community organizing around the issue of constitutional sheriffs, the arguments that they make, and the sort of people that they rally around them?
I think that this is a situation in which public awareness goes a long way. As an example, a positive example, in Illinois, Mac tried to organize an event that he thought would be really huge. Illinois had passed an assault, kind of a limited assault weapons ban, and a group of sheriffs opposed it. And Mac said he was going to do a training and get all these guys together and do a sort of rally. And honestly, there were representatives. There were like people in Congress. There were people on the county level and people on the state level. And like even a few people at the federal level who were like, just made a big deal about how bad it was and how they did not want their sheriff to participate. And, you should not be participating in this. This is, extremist behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, the event flopped. So I think to some extent, like the sort of shame and blame, does this sheriff in Cherokee County, is he aware? He might be aware. Sometimes sheriffs say, like, I don't know, whatever. They're just like, oh, I don't know what Richard Mack says, or I don't know what, Dixie means, whatever. They'll sort of like pretend they don't understand. But like, to some extent, like embarrassing them over hanging out with, kind of, anti-federal extremist type figures appears to be a pretty decent strategy. Like, I think that at the root of it, a lot of people don't want to get in trouble. Because if you appeal to their sense of self-preservation, I will have to say that I have a lot of respect for like folks in the House of Representatives and the Senate who will actually stand up and say that they think this is not good. Like there are few and far between. But if you can get folks to actually like articulate the fact that this is not acceptable. And I will also say it's very hard for people in the Republican Party to do that because they will alienate folks. I know that many people in the Republican Party are perfectly aware of these groups and they're aware of what they stand for. And, they decide to say nothing. But I think pressuring people is like, oh no, it's a big deal. Again, sheriffs don't like being embarrassed. Most sheriffs don't want to be in the news ever. Now, right now, Richard Mack is kind of riding high off. There was a series of articles about him done by an Arizona publication, and he was invited to Fox News for this. So he got to kind of give his public service announcement on Fox News. So he's kind of riding high off of this, coming into this Cherokee event. Like, the problem sometimes is like when he gets press, he will generate it into like positive press. So I also think, though, that that's a pressure point people could use, is to point out that, you know, he is using these, you know, he's kind of like opportunistically leeching on to Cherokee County and the counties surrounding it and trying to recruit these sheriffs, despite the, you know, because he is getting bad press and he's like worried about his organization. Some people, I think, are confused about what he teaches, or maybe not sure. You know, one of the things about sheriffs, especially more rural sheriffs, is that they have a quasi-legitimate gripe, which is that they don't get a lot of training. And sometimes they're like they don't have a lot of opportunities to network and train. And so they often see these Richard Mack trainings as like a chance to get together with like-minded people. Sort of, right? Like, they sort of see it as like a social club as much as it is like a training. And I think that the more you could point out that, like, this is not like training, this is like a recruitment revival. This is a tactic that he has tried. This is an old tactic too. This is like a, you know, anti-communist silver shirts, posse comitatus tactic that like folks have been using for like 100 years to gather people in these little organizations and try to like persuade them that these bad ideas are not so bad. I feel like that's what Richard Mack's general pitch is. Like, these are bad ideas that people say they're bad, but they're not that bad. I think the more that folks point that out, that that's like a real, you know, it's a pressure point. And then, you know, some people nowadays, more people are aware of Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers. There's more of an awareness of how dangerous the far right is. And I do think always pointing out that, you know, when people invite Richard Mack to come, what they are doing is sending a message to the people in their community that is something like, I don't have that much respect for you. I would like to invite this organization that is well known for touting these ideas that are anti-government, that don't benefit people. Like, these are not ideas that help anybody. And that they are sort of like, you know, maybe they're doing it because like the people in their community think it will be popular. But is that what the people in the community really think? Like, one loud person wants the CSPOA there, but do people really want that? And then do they want their county to be a hub of, you know, sort of organizing by sheriffs who just want to promote excessive violence and fear and anxiety about immigrants, about, you know, people of color, about voting? I mean, I just feel like to sort of this idea that like the sheriff thinks his position means he can turn that county into like whatever he wants. I mean, that's pretty anti-democratic.
Well, thank you so much for this, Jessica. I wonder, how can people find your writing? I know you've written in a number of different journals online, like online journals and newspapers about this topic and related topics, but could you tell people where your Substack is and point them to other resources that would be helpful in keeping them informed on this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So my Substack is sheriffs.substack.com. It's pretty easy to remember. I try to put a lot of writings about sheriffs on there, but sometimes I don't have time. So every once in a while, I don't post as much as I should. I try to post on social media. I'm Jess Pish on all the platforms, so pretty easy to find. There are a lot of groups doing a lot of great work around constitutional sheriffs. Two of the ones I recommend. One is the Southern Poverty Law Center. So on their website, the Southern Poverty Law Center has a lot of articles about constitutional sheriffs and kind of keeps up to date with like what constitutional sheriffs are doing. The other one is a group called, their website is IREHR.org. It's the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. They also do quite a lot of work tracking constitutional sheriffs. And both of those organizations have done, you know, a lot of letter writing campaigns and more work to spread information about them. So I think those are two really good resources.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thanks a lot again for having this conversation and for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
I've been pondering the ways that anarchists and poor deluded hierarchs differ. I don't mean in the ideological sense, but more in character. I think I'm ready to share some brilliant observations. You're welcome. There are two characteristics I'd like to discuss. The first is confidence. Hierarchs are high in confidence. They wake up each morning with an unlagging certainty that together with billions of others, they'll keep this civilization program grinding along. They believe in themselves, but also in all those billions of strangers who contribute in ways that the run-of-the-mill hierarch might not even comprehend. They don't necessarily know how government works, but they have high confidence that it'll keep on working, even though evidence all around them screams at them that government has never worked as advertised. They don't understand the economy, but they have ultimate confidence that it will continue today, tomorrow, forever. In fact, the very value of the U.S. dollar is based on nothing more than the investor's confidence in the population's confidence that the dollar has value. That is confidence. The second characteristic I'd like to discuss is imagination. While poor deluded hierarchs have an overabundance of confidence, kind of like an obnoxious drunk at the bar asking women to dance, they lack imagination. When it comes to contemplating creative possibilities, hierarchs are dull as bricks. Ask hierarchs in antiquity to imagine a world without the Roman Empire, and they'd just roll their eyes. Ask them a couple centuries later to imagine a world without the church in charge, and they'd squint at you like you're mad. Ask their grandkids to imagine a world without kings and queens, and you'd get the same response as when you ask today's hierarchs to imagine a world without nation states. But who will pick up the trash? Who will enforce laws? We'll have madness, mayhem, chaos, bedlam. The sky will fall, the world will end, and dogs and cats will engage in interspecies fornications. Never mind that they already have madness, mayhem, chaos, and bedlam. Never mind that a world without nation states might just be an improvement. They can't imagine that. They're high on confidence, low on imagination. They're certain about the existing system and cannot conceive of anything else. Now, anarchists are just the opposite. We're typically big on imagination and woefully short on confidence. Let's talk imagination first. Anarchists have the beautiful capacity to dream beyond the current reality. We have a stubborn insistence that another way of life is possible, a rewarding one with purpose and meaning for everyone, a way of life based upon freedom from exploitation and subjugation. We can conceive of something we haven't seen, something only hinted at in our current reality, a world where many worlds are possible, as the Zapatista slogan goes. But what we lack is confidence. While we can imagine that future world, we don't really think of ourselves as capable of making it happen. We each have a sneaking suspicion that we don't really know what we're doing, that we're not up to the daunting task of changing the world, of toppling an existing global order and somehow moving beyond it to something else. I don't have the skill set for that. I don't know where to start. My friends are lazy and they're not very useful. I have all kinds of issues that disqualify me. We should wait for someone better equipped and more knowledgeable to inspire us to action. Does any of that sound familiar? I bet it does. So we end up with a dream of a better world. Bakunin had that dream, Kropotkin, Proudhon, Emma Goldman. We've had an unrealized dream for hundreds of years, in fact, and here we are, no closer to its manifesting. We don't think we're the ones who can do it. We lack confidence. And lacking confidence, we've never struck up that conversation. What would it take to topple the existing global system? And you know what? You're never going to accomplish a goal you don't set your mind to. What I mean is, you can't focus on some other project. Food, not bombs, perhaps. Not that there's anything wrong with food, not bombs. But you can't focus on some other project, and by succeeding at that project, accidentally topple the global system of exploitation. To make a sports analogy, you can't hit a pitch you're not swinging at. If ever you and I are going to topple the existing shit society and strive for something better, we have to begin talking about how to topple this. What would it take? Who and where and what skill sets? And what would it look like? We have to talk about that, and we have to network with others willing to have that conversation. And we have to believe ourselves worthy and useful and capable. Take comfort from this. Human history is a long train of unprepared knuckleheads managing to accomplish what no other knuckleheads before them had ever managed to do. No one is ever ready to do what's never been done. Not you, not me, not anyone. It isn't a matter of experience. It's a matter of confidence, knowing that when obstacles and challenges and struggles arise, we're going to apply the same approaches together that got us past the last obstacles and challenges and struggles, and the ones before those. The future we deserve is only waiting on you to realize you're the superhero we've all been waiting on, and so is everyone else listening. Confidence, self-belief. The absence of that is the only thing standing between us and the future we all deserve. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm Books is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.